Salve a tutti. Hello everyone. I am Paolo Baracchi. I look after the cultural programs here at CO.AS.IT. It is my pleasure to welcome you all warmly to this virtual tour of Bruno Leti's exhibition Exactitude. Before we start, may I invite you to join me in respectfully acknowledging the Kulin Nation, the traditional custodians of the land in which we live and work. CO.AS.IT's cultural program includes temporary exhibitions, conferences, talks, workshops, film, theatre and music nights, and research projects. It involves both established and emerging artists, scholars and practitioners, and it engages the community as a participant rather than as an audience. The focus of CO.AS.IT's cultural program is Italian-Australian culture. Italian-Australian culture is the creation of a community which, from a modern Australian standpoint, embraces its migrant heritage, draws from canonical Italian culture of the past and of the present, and engages with other cultures. We are very proud today to welcome the distinguished artist Bruno Leti to CO.AS.IT's exhibition gallery. We are here in CO.AS.IT's temporary exhibition space, surrounded by this stunning exhibition, which unfortunately is closed due to public health concerns. Bruno Leti, the artist, is here with me, and he has kindly accepted our invitation to chat with us to help us better understand and appreciate the art that we see around us. So, first of all, Bruno, may I ask you briefly to introduce yourself by saying a few words about your life and in particular about your relationship with Italy, both biographically as a migrant and artistically and intellectually?
Okay, well, maybe I'm a typical child immigrant. I was about 10 years old when I came to Australia. As all children, we don't have a choice. We come with parents. So during the war, or 1941 in fact, as my mother would say, bombs were flying overhead, I was born. We're fundamentally Roman, but we moved for safety to Rock Antica, 70 kilometers or so. And there I had my childhood, which was, as children, we don't really understand war and chaos and difficulties, but that's where my, shall we say, formed life as an individual began. A country, Italy, but of course, having become an immigrant at an early age, you don't forget those things. In fact, with time, I really feel that they become deeper, more knowledgeable, and more emotional, and you want to know more about where you come from. So, although I am very Australian in many ways, but I'm also very Italian in other ways, particularly with time that we've had, and the times that I have returned to the country with many possibilities and cultural events and so on.
This exhibition, which Bruno curated specifically for CO.AS.IT, is called Exactitude, Works of the 80s and Beyond. In the title, Exactitude, there is already an Italian reference, a literary reference to be more precise, to one of Italo Calvino's 6 memos for the next millennium, published in 1988. The other memos are lightness, quickness, visibility, multiplicity, and consistency. Art historian Sasha Grishin first brought together Bruno Leti and Italo Calvino in a systematic way in his 2002 monograph, 6 Memos on the Art of Bruno Leti. So there seems to be, Bruno, a triad, Leti, Calvino, Grishin. I wonder whether you could say a few words to help us unpack the relationships between these 3 men.
Well, Calvino was one of those writers whom I knew about, but I didn't know at this stage that Professor Grishin was going to use the raft of the 6 memos as the idea to explain my work over a particular period, which at that time was probably about 50 odd years. But I think the triad idea is that Sasha Grishin, art historian at the National University in Canberra, had decided to really put together this book which wanted to explain the Italian part of my values, philosophically speaking. And the raft of the 6 ideas, and by the way, it didn't get to the end because he died rather suddenly at the end of 1985. I think the triad was something that he created because of my knowledge of Calvino, his understanding of Calvino, and the fact that, in fact, Calvino is only half a generation ahead of me, and I think that he was, in a way, a good metaphor for my understanding of life ahead of me. And I think that his values that he was thinking about, he was concerned that Italian society, the language was kind of going downhill a little, and I think that he wanted to propose these 6 ideas which are really values which are important for a society of any kind. And I think Professor Grishin's idea of attaching this meaning to not only a verbal and literature idea, but also to the visual arts, because he felt there was an association between the visual arts and literature, language, and so on. And so the raft was used to carry these ideas of these 6 principal values right through from the beginning of my time and explaining it through the visual kind of art that I make.
This exhibition draws together works produced over some 34 years in a very different media. A concern with landscape seems to be the most readily identifiable common trait. Art critic Sheridan Palmer talks about you, Bruno, as an artist, and I quote, fundamentally concerned about place, both the physical aspects of location and the spiritual perception of it. So I know it's a very complex, very big question, but would you mind telling us something about your sense of place and your relationship to landscapes, Italian, Australian, and in this exhibition also Chinese?
Well, what Dr. Palmer was talking about, we've often talked about with also Professor Grishin, is that as a child immigrant, one who's born somewhere else, I grew up, as I said already, I was a formed child. They say psychologically that you're formed by the age of 7. So I came to Australia, I was nearly 10. And I think that the idea of the landscape was part of my growing up. And I understood my sense of place rather than being an urban person. I was a person in nature, and therefore both the Sabina in Italy and Plombinane central Victoria became my sense of place, and the landscape was an inevitable part of my expression. The sense of place was to do with the idea of nature and the landscape which constantly surrounded me, and therefore I grew to love that environment, which was often a metaphor for saying a lot of other things, but most of all the idea of respecting nature as, well, particularly the Australian landscape is a beautiful landscape that I have grown to love because I have travelled right through this country. And the idea of prior, maybe Australian artists like Fred Williams or Ian Fairweather and so on, people like that have inevitably, as we grow, we are influenced by life itself. And I think that this sense of place has a lot to do with the idea of the landscape, being in the landscape, but being part of nature, and therefore being, that creates that sense of place that we are all attuned to.
There are four main groups of works in Exactitude. The Domain Park series in this exhibition is represented by 7 large oil paintings executed between 1983 and 1987, connected with the theme of the garden as an artificial landscape freely developed as an object of beauty.
Well, I think that probably the idea of the garden came about for 2 reasons. I think possibly that I became a much more urbanized artist, and I wasn't going out in the landscape, so the idea of the Domain Park or the Botanical Gardens in Melbourne provided for me, if you like, an enclosed possibility of a landscape within an urban area, but fundamentally a garden has symbols in many cultures, and I think it was a way for me to express my ideas about nature, but a cultivated nature, as it were. And at the same time, I also must point out that at that time I had already given away teaching. I've become a full-time artist, and I have a little boy that was born, and that gave me the incentive, of course, to remain within my environment. And I live very close to the Botanical Gardens in Melbourne, and I would take the boy for a little walk, and I would make sketches and take photographs and so on. But the symbolism of a garden is fundamentally one of culture and one of a specific love that I've always had for a garden, because it's the idea of optimism, because if you do grow a garden, you grow a garden with the idea that it will grow, and therefore you are an optimist and you continue in life. And so the garden has a very important part in my art, which has been repeated at various times. And I also have to say, this was a part of my life when these particular paintings of the Domain series was mainly, I considered them perhaps to be the high point of my painting career. I was at my strength and more youthful, expressionistic form, which there's no doubt that with my age at that time, American Expressionism, as became known as the New York School, was an important element which I had a big influence. And subsequently, of course, gone backwards and forwards to New York and come back and back to Italy, and all these influences maintained this particular gestural form of art, which was definitely retain, if you like, a realistic value, or it came from the natural source where my gesture of the arm and the hand was part of nature itself, because I am part of nature and nature is part of nature, and the gesture of the hand and the arm in a sense symbolized, if you like. So it wasn't just for the images itself. It was for the garden, it was for the nature, it was for the human association with nature and part of it. And this particular period continued on and off with changes perhaps in mode of style. The main period from the early 80s to the late 80s, right down to the 90s, and then of course later on we have a whole series of times when the idea of the landscape changed in nature, but it changed because of time, but it changed also because as an artist one changes, not only in stylistic form, but also in philosophical terms.
The theme of the landscape extended in Bruno's art to other media. This can be seen in the second group of works in this exhibition, the 4 Huangshan Lambda photographs from 2004 and the 4 oils on paper dated 2006 and 2008, which seem to me to form one lyrical group in which Bruno responds to the natural sublime.
I have to say that the idea of a continuation of my interest in landscape, of course with my travels around the world, particularly the East, and Eastern culture became a coincidence of perhaps two things. My association with friends and partner, which is of Chinese origin, but the other thing was to do with the art of Ian Fairweather, who is loved as an Australian adopted artist who came from Scotland, but his ideas about the landscape did have an influence on me as the figurative and the abstract began to blend together. So the idea of the abstract evolved from the figuration of what you see, but then taking photographs and making pictures on paper or canvas became a kind of blend between not only two mediums, but also between two ideas. And of course the style begins to change somewhat. And I think that the symbolism of the garden became married to a natural landscape, where, for example, Sasha Grishin calls it the hortus conclusus, which is fundamentally a tended garden, so that the Huangshan Mountains, for example, are very much like any other part of nature. Mountains, and often called the Yellow Mountains, where traditional Chinese culture, for example, considered the Yellow Mountains a way of man climbing the mountains, like perhaps in Purgatorio Dante climbed the mountains to undo the badness of humanity and turn people into goodness. And this what the Yellow Emperor, in fact, was the symbol of the idea of purifying man and improving the traditions of humanity and the goodness of people. And so this part of my art was coming to the end of the idea of what landscape stood for me, both as a symbol, as an emblem, and as a material reality of both maybe in Chinese landscape or Italian landscape or even Australian landscape. Most of all, perhaps Australian landscape, which I think is very unique and very beautiful.
I think the third group of works in this exhibition is the 4 Cloons paintings dating between 1987 and 1990, which show landscapes that are gently molded by human activities of living and working.
I think that this particular period was mainly to do with an Australian historical past. Now, Cloons is in that central area of Victoria renowned for the gold, and it was probably the first area in the whole of Australia where mass immigration from all kinds of countries, particularly after the 49ers of the gold rushes in California. Cloons is one of those landscapes that does remind me in many ways of the overall feeling of, not just because it's historical, but the settings of old architecture and so on. It gives it a particular flavour which is in some way both kind of European, Italian or anglicised or whatever, where age, history come together. And so I suppose when I paint pictures, it's not just always to do with the outcome, although the outcome is very important because we're talking about a visual language, but it's also to do with a metaphor for the idea of humanity being part of that landscape. And particularly during the gold rushes, I think this was the first time that multiculturalism in Australia actually began in the middle of the 19th century. And the 1850s to the 1870s, maybe to the 1880s, Melbourne was a very rich city, and there was a lot of wealth. And this is where we've got the leftovers of the architecture, which we still love today, and has some heritage which we like to keep. And I think the paintings have something to do with that notion of history, culture, people, literature, and of course, wealth, a lot of wealth.
The final group of works in this exhibition comprises 4 works dating from 1974 to 1986. They explore different artistic reactions in different media to different Australian landscapes.
Well, I'd like to say here that perhaps art for me is part of a lived experience, and I think for most artists or serious artists, I think it's not something that you do part-time or weekends. It's a lived experience. It becomes part of you. I live my art. And so my experiences, whether I travel to Europe or whether I travel to America or China or wherever it may be, it is a lived experience. And with this one records visually and in memory a lot of these ideas. And Clonbinane, for example, was the place that I went to as a child. I was 10 years old, surrounded by Australian landscape, the kangaroos, the koalas, everything that we call Australia. And of course, you know, other places in Australia. For example, Queenstown in Tasmania reminded me very much of some of those hill towns that we find in Italy, very beautiful. But it's also a place, or it was a place of great industry and metal industry, for example, tin mines and copper mines, which fundamentally killed the whole environment with the sulfuric acid that they produced. And Queenstown was one of those places that became, because of the negativity of the lack of care of landscape, it became almost beautiful because the sulfur killed the whole vegetation and turned it into a mass of colour. And this for an artist was somewhat confronting. Green fields and divided fields and other medium all became much more abstract at this point. And I was veering towards the geometry of structure, which was an important element as far as Calvino was concerned. But here I would like to point out the idea of the geometry and the idea of the reality of the physics of nature are very much a much more recent influence by an Italian writer, by Carlo Rovelli, who really talks about that the idea of structure is not only in the physics of the making that we don't see, but for me it's both a mental structure, it is also the geometry which I began probably as a young artist student. I began as a geometric, structural artist in my learning and understanding of people like, I don't know, Cézanne, for example, and so on. And structure was very important. So I could see at this point I was returning slowly to the structural boundaries of my earlier times and a greater sense of abstraction. And if you see my work now, perhaps, and hopefully we might get a glimpse of it, you will see that I have returned to my early times of where structure in a geometric sense without any elemental realism involved in it at all. So it's kind of an inner feeling of the physics of the reality of the world as it is structured by nature, and that's what it's really all about.